Welcome to my channel. Please like, subscribe and share. Once upon a time there lived Ada, a loving and happy only child of her mother Maria. Her earliest memories were filled with warmth and laughter. Her mother was a woman whose kindness was known throughout the town. Despite their modest living, Maria made Ada feel like the most important person in the world. Their small home, tucked in a quiet corner of the village, always smelled of freshly baked bread and flowers from the garden they tended together. Even though her husband James had a second wife, they were content and happy. Maria taught Ada how to plant roses, sharing stories of how each bloom symbolized love and resilience. These flowers, Maria would say, are like you, Ada. Beautiful, strong, and capable of thriving even in the harshest soil. Ada cherished these words, feeling safe and loved in her mother's presence. When Ada fell and scraped her knee while playing, Maria would scoop her up and kiss her tears away. "You're my brave little girl," she'd whisper, wrapping Ada's small frame in her arms. Ada idolized her mother, a woman of unshakable faith and endless patience, who worked tirelessly to ensure her daughter never lacked anything. But life had its cruel ways of altering even the most beautiful stories. One cold morning, Maria's health took a turn for the worse. She had been coughing persistently, but Maria brushed it off as nothing serious. Ada watched her mother push through each day, still tending to their garden and humming lullabies to her. But soon, the humming stopped. Maria grew weaker, her laughter fading into silence. Greenfield's only clinic was understaffed and underfunded, and the doctors there could do little but shake their heads. Ada stayed by Maria's bedside, holding her hand and praying for a miracle. "Ada, my love," Maria said one evening, her voice barely audible, "always remember to be kind, no matter what. The world might not be fair, but your heart can be. Promise me you'll never lose your kindness." Through tears, Ada promised, clutching her mother's hand as if holding on could keep her alive. Maria passed away that night. The house felt colder than ever before. The garden seemed to wither alongside Maria's absence, and Ada's laughter disappeared with her mother's. Life as she knew it had ended. Soon after Maria's death, Ada's father, Mr. James, came to take her to his home in Hilltown. Ada had met him only a handful of times. He was a reserved man, busy with his trade as a merchant. Hilltown was larger and noisier than Greenfield, its cobblestone streets crowded with traders, carts, and curious faces. Mr. James's home was nothing like the warm, humble abode Ada shared with her mother. It was grand but cold, with high walls and imposing doors. Inside, Ada was introduced to Mrs. Rose, her father's second wife, and her two daughters, Linda and Becky. "So, this is Maria's child," Mrs. Rose said with a forced smile. Her gaze swept over Ada, assessing her like one might inspect a servant. Linda and Becky stood behind her, whispering and giggling. Ada felt out of place and unwelcome, but she remained polite, remembering her mother's advice to be kind. Life under Mrs. Rose's roof was far from what Ada expected. From the first morning, it was clear she was not seen as part of the family. While Linda and Becky lounged in their rooms, discussing beauty treatments and new dresses, Ada was handed a long list of chores. "You will clean the floors, wash the clothes, and fetch water from the well," Mrs. Rose instructed sharply. "I expect everything to be done perfectly. No slacking." Ada worked tirelessly, scrubbing floors until her hands ached and carrying heavy buckets of water that made her arms tremble. Linda and Becky mocked her, calling her Cinderella, and laughing at her worn-out clothes. "You look like you've been dragged through mud, Ada," Linda teased one evening. Becky joined in, adding, "Maybe she's trying to catch a prince like this." Their laughter stung, but Ada said nothing. She reminded herself of her mother's words and carried on with her tasks. Mr. James noticed Ada's plight, but said little. Mrs. Rose's temper was legendary, and he had long since learned to avoid confrontation. He offered Ada quiet words of encouragement when he could. "Be strong, Ada," he told her one evening. "Life has a way of rewarding those who endure with grace." Ada nodded, but inside, she wondered how much more she could endure. One bright morning, Mrs. Rose sent Ada on an errand to the bustling Hilltown marketplace. As she carried a basket filled with goods, she accidentally bumped into a young man dressed in fine clothes looking wealthy. The basket tumbled, its contents scattering across the ground. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Ada said quickly, bending to gather the items. The man knelt to help her. "No need to apologize," he said with a kind smile. His name was David, and he was unlike anyone Ada had ever met. Handsome and polite, he spoke to her with respect, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Their conversation was brief, but David was captivated by Ada's humility and grace. As she walked away, he found himself unable to forget her. Back at the house, Ada's encounter went unmentioned. She had no idea how this chance meeting would soon change her life forever. David couldn't shake the memory of Ada. Despite his wealth and status, he admired her gentle demeanor and natural beauty. He began asking around in Hilltown, learning of the servant girl who worked tirelessly for her stepmother. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rose had begun to hear whispers of David's interest. Though she hadn't connected him to Ada, she saw an opportunity. Linda and Becky would make excellent wives for a man like that, she told herself. Ada continued her chores, unaware of David's growing determination to see her again. As tension simmered, a storm was on the horizon, ready to disrupt their lives in ways no one could predict. David's curiosity about Ada only deepened with each passing day. He had heard tales of the young woman who bore the brunt of her stepmother's harshness, but carried herself with quiet dignity. Intrigued by her resilience, he decided to visit the marketplace more frequently, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. It wasn't long before their paths crossed once more. Ada, carrying a heavy bundle of firewood, was struggling to balance her load as she made her way through the crowded street. Spotting her, David stepped forward and offered his help. "Let me carry that for you," he said, his tone firm but kind. Ada hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, sir, but I can manage," she replied softly. David shook his head. "I insist. Please." Reluctantly, Ada allowed him to take the bundle from her arms. As they walked together, David asked about her life, but Ada, cautious of drawing unwanted attention, kept her answers brief. Still, David was captivated by her modesty and the quiet strength that radiated from her. When they reached her home, David handed her the firewood and said, "If you ever need help, you can count on me." Ada thanked him politely, unaware that this encounter had solidified David's resolve to learn more about her. Word of David's interest in Ada soon reached Mrs. Rose through the village gossip. At first, she dismissed it as nonsense, convinced that no man of David's status would ever be interested in her stepdaughter. But when she overheard Linda and Becky whispering about David's frequent visits to the marketplace, her suspicions grew. Determined to take control of the situation, Mrs. Rose began crafting a plan. If David truly sought a bride, she would ensure he chose one of her daughters. He must see Linda and Becky as the better choice, she thought. Ada will not steal this opportunity. Mrs. Rose wasted no time. She dressed Linda and Becky in their finest clothes and instructed them to spend more time in the marketplace, hoping they would catch David's eye. She also ordered Ada to remain at home, taking on even more chores to keep her out of sight. "You're not to leave this house unless I say so," Mrs. Rose commanded. "Do you understand?" Ada nodded, her heart sinking. She couldn't understand why she was being confined, but she obeyed without question. Linda and Becky, eager to impress, paraded through the marketplace daily. They laughed loudly, batted their eyelashes, and made every effort to draw attention to themselves. But no matter what they did, David remained uninterested. He continued to ask about Ada, much to Mrs. Rose's frustration. Mr. James began to notice the tension growing in his household. He saw how Mrs. Rose schemed to elevate her daughters, and how Ada's spirit seemed to shrink under the weight of her stepmother's control. One evening, he approached Mrs. Rose. "Why are you treating Ada so harshly? She's just a child." Mrs. Rose glared at him, her voice sharp. "She needs to learn her place. If David is truly interested in this family, it will be because of Linda or Becky. Ada will only ruin our chances." Mr. James sighed but said nothing more. He felt powerless against his wife's strong will, yet he silently resolved to watch over Ada as best he could. David decided to take matters into his own hands. He visited Ada's home, carrying gifts of food and fabric. When Mrs. Rose greeted him at the door, he smiled politely and said, "I would like to speak with Mr. James." Mrs. Rose, taken aback, quickly composed herself. "Of course," she said, ushering him inside. She called for Mr. James, while Linda and Becky hovered nearby, giggling and trying to catch David's attention. When Mr. James entered the room, David stood and spoke confidently. "Sir, I've come to express my interest in marrying your daughter, Ada." The room fell silent. Mrs. Rose's smile froze, and her daughters stared in disbelief. Mr. James, though surprised, managed to respond. "That's unexpected. Ada is young, and I must consider what is best for her." Mrs. Rose quickly intervened. "Perhaps you've mistaken Ada for Linda or Becky," she said sweetly. "They are more suited to someone of your stature." David shook his head firmly. "I am certain of my choice. Ada possesses a grace and character that I admire deeply." The tension in the room was palpable, as Mrs. Rose struggled to maintain her composure. Inside, she was seething. How dare he choose Ada over her daughters? "We will discuss this further," Mr. James said, trying to defuse the situation. David nodded. "Thank you, sir. I look forward to your response." As he left, Mrs. Rose's fury boiled over. She turned to Mr. James, her voice venomous. "You will not allow this. I won't let Ada ruin everything." Mr. James stared at her. "We'll see." The stage was set for a battle of wills, with Ada caught in the middle, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Mrs. Rose, unable to accept David's preference for Ada, decided to take drastic measures. Late one evening, while the household was asleep, she summoned Linda and Becky to her room. "We must act quickly," she whispered, her eyes burning with determination. "If we let this continue, Ada will take everything meant for you." "What do you mean, Mama?" Linda asked nervously. Mrs. Rose's voice turned icy. "We'll make sure Ada disappears from David's life. Permanently." Unaware of the plot against her, Ada continued to go about her duties the following day. But as night fell, An uneasy feeling crept over her. The household was quieter than usual, and the flickering shadows cast by the oil lamps seemed to stretch ominously. Suddenly, the door to her small room burst open, and two strangers entered. They grabbed Ada, muffling her cries with a cloth as they dragged her out into the darkness. Terrified, Ada struggled, but their grip was too strong. "Don't fight it," one of them growled. "We have orders." Far away, in another part of the house, Mrs. Rose smirked as she heard the muffled sound of footsteps fading into the night. This will be the end of Ada's interference, she thought. But what Mrs. Rose didn't realize was that her plan would soon unravel in ways she couldn't control. David had secretly followed Ada's trail earlier in the day, and was already suspicious of Mrs. Rose's intentions. When he noticed Ada's absence from the marketplace the next morning, he knew something was wrong. The question remained, would he find her in time, or would Mrs. Rose's dark scheme succeed? To be continued. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.